Hi, I am going to be talking about the lymphatic system and going over the pertinent information that we need to cover during this system for this recording. So I hope you all enjoy this. I would like to say that this is the one system that I tend to see that students have really the least amount of knowledge coming in on. Everybody's heard of lymph nodes, but there are many students who expressed to me in the past when I've been talking about this that they really didn't understand how extensive the lymphatic system was, or even understand that there was an entire another vascular system that we actually have carrying another very important fluid around the body that's called lymph. So I hope you will find this interesting, and we will go ahead and get started with this and making sure that we understand what our immune system is all about that contains this lymphatic system. So when we think about the lymphatic system, I want you to picture, because we have just finished talking about the cardiovascular system, where we have a heart that's a right side of the heart pump and the left pump, the pulmonary pump and the systemic pump, pumping blood throughout our system. We know we have systemic arteries that are delivering nutrients and fluids to our tissues, and then systemic veins that are returning that blood to the right side of the heart to be pumped to the lungs to do it again, to do it all over again. So we've just learned about those major systemic arteries and major systemic veins, but now I want you to look at what I call the lymphatic man. And what you're seeing here is that we have an entire another set of vessels that are throughout the body. Every tissue within the body that is composing organs within the body has these lymphatic vessels that are returning fluid, very important fluid called lymph, to our bloodstream. And what I want you to know is that lymph is a very clear, colorless, very similar to plasma fluid, but with much less proteins, that is bathing our tissues. So this tissue fluid that is bathing our cells and keeping our cells, the chemical stability within our cells, what it needs to be, is constantly being refreshed from blood plasma. So water moves out of these capillary beds from the blood plasma. Plasma is mostly water. It moves out, and as it moves out, the water that's already there in our tissue spaces will be pushed into these very specialized vessels called lymph vessels, lymphatic vessels, and it will be returned, if it's down here, it will be returned all the way through these lymphatic vessels to the subclavian vein. So again, lymphatic fluid cycle, this lymphatic fluid cycle, and the fluid itself is called lymph. It comes from blood plasma, moving into the tissue spaces from blood plasma. It's mostly water. It is bathing our cells, and as the pressure on it increases, it enters into these vessels that have closed endings. These vessels are a little bit different from blood vessels, because you remember I talk about blood vessels being a closed system. It's closed. But in this case, these lymphatic vessels they end right here, so the lymph can move into these vessel spaces and be pushed back up through the entire body, whether it was the hand or whether it was up here in your scalp. The lymph moves through the lymphatic vessels until it's returned by way of the subclavian vein, which you all just saw where that was when we were talking about vessels, the subclavian vein, and it's returned back to the bloodstream. So lymph greatly contributes to blood volume. So that's one of its functions, is that it's contributing to blood volume. It actually comes from blood, so it needs to be returned back to the blood after it's bathed our tissue spaces. So we'll go back up here now. And I think that that's where students are often thinking they didn't really realize that they had on autopsy or whatever, that there's this entire another vascular system that's there. And just like veins and arteries have a muscle layer middle wall. So do these larger lymphatic vessels. They also as well. And again, what's going to be found in the lumens of lymphatic vessels will be this fluid that we call lymph. It's important that you know that the fluid that we call lymph comes from blood plasma. And as that fluid moves into the tissue spaces, it's clear, colorless fluid, similar to the plasma but with less proteins, bathing our tissues, keeping the chemical stability when it needs to be, protecting, and then moving into these vessels. And as it moves into these vessels, it will move in the direction toward the subclavian vein so that it can be returned back to the bloodstream. So we're going to talk about this, and you can see some of the numbers of how much this actually happens in a day. But what's really important to think about when we think about this, each person, is that every single tissue space has to have lymphatic return. So when you think about that, maybe it makes sense to you that interference with it, interference in any area, whether it's to the appendage like an arm or leg, if there's interference to this, it's going to cause swelling in that area, which is called edema. And then that edema can actually put undue burden on those tissues and cause those tissues not to be functioning the way that they should. So, and that can also, if it's enough of an area that's affected by that, it not only compromises the area, it also could even end up compromising blood volume. So lymph, make sure you know what lymph is, make sure you know where it comes from, make sure you know where it's eventually returned back to, and that it's returned back to the bloodstream by way of these lymphatic capillaries that end up becoming larger. These are the tissues being bathed, larger and larger vessels that then would return it back through by way of the subclavian vein to the bloodstream. So this is the lymphatic fluid cycle in a nutshell. So all of our tissues are being bathed, are getting nutrients and fluids through the capillaries, the blood capillaries that we just learned about. But they're also the fluid that's entering into our tissue spaces is being recycled. It's bathing the tissues and being recycled through the lymphatic system return. So this picture is important because it allows us to see one particular area. And when we're looking at this particular area, you all have unfortunately probably known somebody or heard of breast cancer. And as we said, all of our tissue spaces have lymphatic return that's returning lymph back to the bloodstream, contributing to blood volume. But before it's returned back, it's going to move through these very special little mini organs, if you will, called lymph nodes. These lymph nodes, if I took a lymph node and blew it up here for you and did a little illustrated dissection, the lymph comes into these lymph nodes by many different vessels, but it exits only through one. And what this allows for is the lymph fluid to sort of stay in this node for a bit of time. And the nodes have very specialized white cells, lymphocytes that you all know about, macrophages, which are derived from monocytes. So it gives these white blood cells time to look for foreign antigens, which could mean that they're potential pathogens. So to think about the tissue spaces out here, being bathed in that fluid, potentially picking up, maybe you stepped on a splinter, maybe, I don't know what you did, but introduce something foreign. It would come into the lymph node. It would get the lymph node just by its design, its engineering, if you will, keeps the fluid in here for a little bit of time, enough time to filter it so that these white cells that are found here could recognize if there's something foreign and actually respond to that foreign antigen and take it out and destroy it before the lymph goes on its way. So think about that now in this particular, just one example of this particular area. So It goes through lots of different lymph nodes before it gets returned back to the bloodstream to ensure that any potential danger, pathogen, or any potential danger could be cleared from it and destroyed before it gets to the bloodstream. You don't want any pathogens getting to the bloodstream. Actively growing microorganisms in the bloodstream leads to something called sepsis. I want you to know that term, sepsis, S-E-P-S-I-S. Sepsis is actively growing microorganisms in the bloodstream. It can be any type of micro, or it can be a bacteria, any type of microbes growing, and it's dangerous. So 1 in 4 people who become septic, even with the best medical care, will not survive it. So this is a very serious prognosis. The reason we don't hear about it more often is that we have lymphatic systems that typically work. We're always, stumping our toe, biting hangnails. We're always things are getting introduced into our system, in our throat and our nose and our eyes. We have things that are being introduced to our system, but our lymph system is actually clearing them way before they get back to the bloodstream by way of the lymphatic return. So thank you, lymphatic system. I want to show you this area too because of just one example of how you guys have heard of cancers, and you know that certain cancers, when they will, if they're operable, if they can operate, they will remove the cancer, and then you hear about them taking lymph nodes when they remove the cancer. So if the cancer were here, that when they go in, they actually remove a margin around where the cancerous tissues were. They try to remove a margin of healthy tissue to make sure they get it all. But then they actually put in a dye, and that dye moves through the lymph drainage, and they watch it. They literally watch the dye. The first node that the dye gets to is called the sentinel or guardian node for that particular site. And then they watch that dye move through, and then they're typically going to take a certain number of lymph nodes and analyze those in the pathology lab. What they would like to see is that none of the nodes have any cells that look like cancerous cells in the nodes. I'm just going to go back to the node itself. So they look at this, and they're looking for cancerous cells in that node, and they hope they see none. Sometimes they'll say that, 1 out of the 7 nodes were positive, and what you hope for is that 0 out of them are positive. But that can actually, if there are some that are positive, it means there's a higher chance that malignancy, those cells that were cancerous, had gotten through the lymphatic system and might have gotten to the bloodstream. And if that's the case, it's more of a chance that the cancer has metastasized. And we remember the term metastatic cancer means, or cancer that has metastasized, means that the cancer has gone beyond the site where it originated in, and now it's in other areas of the body. And that's never a good prognosis for cancer, because that is what leads to cancer deaths, is when cancer has metastasized. So this is the reason that they take lymph nodes, is that we know lymph is bathing all of our tissue spaces, including spaces that actually may be cancerous. So remember, all of our tissues, hands, feet, toes, all of them have lymphatic return. When you have and nodes which act as, they function, a lymph node is, and we would want to definitely know, they function to filter lymph. Make sure you know they function to filter lymph. They do that by having these very specialized white cells that are just looking for foreign antigens that they can destroy, and they usually do a really, really good job of it. Maybe it makes sense to you that where we have areas where a lot of potential foreign antigens, I talk about foreign antigens, foreign proteins, which are related to microorganisms. Where we have chances for them to enter, like our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our genitals, we have a lot of lymph nodes in those sites. So there's a ton of lymph nodes here for us. And a swollen lymph node is a lymph node that's doing its job. That's not a bad thing. That means that it's doing its job. It's why we've probably all had a sore throat or a few sore throats in your life where your lymph nodes really swole up, didn't they? They were really swollen. And that's not a bad thing. That actually indicates that the body's doing what it's supposed to be doing. The lymph nodes are working as they're supposed to be working. They're swelling, they're holding that fluid there until they can start destroying those pathogens before they go any further. The problem comes in when lymph nodes get so swollen that they become really painful, or they become so swollen that they have a hard time draining. And that actually can happen sometimes, and sometimes it's rare, but if that happens, then sometimes they actually even have to remove the lymph node just because it has become so enlarged and it's lasted so long. It can take months for a lymph node to actually completely drain after certain infections, and that's not that abnormal either. So the mechanisms of the flow is lymph moves pretty slowly, doesn't it? But it needs to keep moving in one direction, and that one direction is back up to that subclavian vein to return back to the bloodstream, the blood volume. Lymphatic vessels have something that veins have to ensure one-way flow, and that's valves. So that is ensuring one-way flow. Moving helps you with lymphatic return. This is why if people have like edema of the extremities and whatnot, they'll say gravity can help, so you can put your feet up or you can do whatever, but also just walking and moving and getting going and moving, because the same way that the right venous blood return happens is the same way the lymphatic return actually happens, and we need that lymphatic return to be moving all the time because it's clearing the tissue spaces, and so we really want to have that happen. We also have a ton of lymph nodes and lymphatic tissue in areas like the small intestines, where the chyme, which is really food, if you will, that has been digested, is moving into the colon. The colon has a lot of microorganisms in it. Now, obviously, they shouldn't ever be out of the colon. The appendix should never rupture, and nothing should ever happen there, because the peritoneal fluid that's bathing our intestines should be sterile. But every now and then, if anything did leak out, we have a ton of lymphatic tissues and cells and lymph nodes that are protecting us in these areas where we can sometimes have these pathogens. You have a lot of lymph nodes under your arm because we use our hands and they get injured, don't they? And things will get destroyed before it gets back to the bloodstream. We have behind our knees because we walk on our feet, we injure our feet. That's okay. We have introduction of potential pathogens whenever we injure our bodies, and that fluid has to move through the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system does a beautiful job at actually taking out those foreign antigens. And so, it's really doing what it's supposed to be doing. The tonsils. Tonsils get kind of a bad name, especially if there's somebody who has tonsillitis, recurring tonsillitis. Tonsillitis means inflammation of the tonsils, right? We actually have 3 sets of tonsils. We have the Palatine tonsils, which are those tonsils that are the ones that you think about when you tell somebody to say ah, and let you look at their tonsils on the sides of the posterior part of the pharynx. The pharynx is the throat. You have pharyngeal tonsils, which are on the back wall of your nasopharynx. So if you looked up your, deep back into the nose or slightly superior to the oropharynx, you would see these pharyngeal tonsils, which people call adenoids. People call them adenoids. Lingual tonsils are on the back of your tongue. So when people have tonsillectomies, they're removing these palatine tonsils. These pharyngeal tonsils, and it's really a singular one that just looks like a right and left area. These are adenoids, So people refer to these as adenoids or adenoidectomies, tonsillectomies, adenoidectomies. These are what's removed when you're talking about tonsil removal. But tonsils serve a really important function, and they're part of our immune system. Tonsils are. They have these crypts that are necessary for trapping. You know, we eat food and water that's not sterile. It's not even supposed to be. It doesn't have to be, because we have so many mechanisms in place that are going to actually reduce the microbial count of whatever we put in our mouths. But we have these built-in mechanisms. The tonsils are one of them, where they have these crypts that actually trap potential pathogens, and then these nodules that actually are composed of white cells that are going to, again, take out and attack any potential pathogens. The problem comes in with tonsils when you have somebody who has recurring tonsillitis. Tonsillitis means inflammation of the tonsil. Inflammation causes swelling, pain, redness, and heat. But with this constant swelling and whatever that can happen with tonsils, then these crypts can get really bigger. And you'll hear about people having cryptic tonsils, which means now the tonsils aren't so much working as they're really designed to be. They may be trapping things that then can make the situation even worse. So an ENT, ears, nose, and throat specialist, an ENT, is going to, if somebody has recurring tonsillitis, especially recurring tonsillitis from Streptococcus pyogenes, which is a bacterial cause of it, instead of just a virus. Viral causes. Most are viral. And then the rarest are bacterial, like Streptococcus pyogenes. An ear, nose, and throat specialist, before they just decide to do a tonsillectomy, they're going to really evaluate what is best in taking the tonsils out, because tonsils do serve a function in the immune system. But if they have become where they are maybe now the problem itself, and they are seeding infections because of their anatomy, they've become so necrotic and so malformed and so whatever, because there's been so many prior infections, sometimes they decide to remove them. But they don't remove them as often as they used to many years ago. They realized they were probably taking out too many tonsils, so now there really has to be certain criteria before they take the tonsils out, because they are part of your immune system. The thymus. We've visited the thymus before when we talked about the endocrine system, and here it is again, the thymus. And I want you to take a look. This is obviously a little illustration of a young person here. You can tell from the outline of the shoulders. And here is a young adult. So when you are looking at this young person and looking at this thymus gland, it's very, the tissue is said to be friable. Glands have a unique look because of the epithelial tissue. But the thymus is huge in a young child. And as we age, even as a young adult, it is now involuted, so shrunken, if you will, and involuted. And as we age to senior citizens, it actually starts to get replaced by adipose. We learned in the endocrine system that the thymus is very, very important for secreting a group of hormones called thymosins that target T lymphocytes, which are specialized white blood cells that we absolutely need for specific and non-specific immunity for our protection. Immunity means protection. So for protection. And maybe it makes sense to you that these thymosins, and from the thymus, it's much larger when you're a child because everything's new to your immune system. So when you are an infant and you are toddler and you are a young child, everything that's in your environment, cold viruses, and I'm just so many things, but also even natural foreign antigens like pollen and dust and things that are just natural in your world, everything's new. So your immune system has to learn it. It has to learn, like, is this friendly? Is this foe? Is this part of the ecosystem? Should I be responding to this? It has to learn it all. So a young person is very much immunologically challenged in the sense that everything is new. So yes, their thymus is having to work hard and having to actually go through all of that. And then as we age, we have figured out our ecosystems. We've figured out what's in our ecosystems that we shouldn't be responding to. And we've also encountered many of the natural potential pathogens like the cold viruses that are part of our world. You know, a lot of people don't realize that you can't have the same cold twice. You don't have the same colds twice. This is why young kids have so many more colds than older people do. And the reason is, by the time we're young adults or older, we've already been exposed to the particular one. The problems are that there's hundreds of different viruses that can lead to colds. So, you know, it's not like you get through them all. You don't. You still continue to be introduced to things your immune system hadn't seen before. And when that's the case, you actually go through the illness, right, until you feel better. But anyway, so that's the thymus. This is where it's located. It's said to be mediastinum, which is sort of mid-chest area, right beneath the sternum, isn't it? You all learned where it was in the endocrine system, and so here it is again. You are revisiting these thymosins, which are the hormones that it releases, and you know that they target the T lymphocytes, which are going to provide us immunity. Another organ that we think about with our immune system is the spleen. The spleen, to give you an idea of where it is, and again, let's go back and well, you can't see it from here, but I'm going to tell you the spleen is, this is the liver, and the stomach would be right here. The stomach is a J-shaped organ that's right here. The stomach empties into the small intestines. The spleen is just slightly inferior and laterally dorsal to the stomach. So the spleen is right here. The spleen is right here, almost kind of hugging the backside of the stomach, but of course you don't see the stomach. This is all the liver, but that's where the spleen would be located. Typically, that's where it's situated, inferior to the diaphragm, dorsal to the stomach. So I just sort of gave you a picture of that. And these are the functions of the spleen. We can live without a spleen. You've heard of people having splenectomies, and they do fine with the splenectomy. Splenectomy means removal of the spleen. But the fact is, we don't want to have to do without spleen because it's part of our immune system. And it's very, very protective. Look at the immune reactions so it filters blood, and it's one of the first sites where foreign, and this should say detecting foreign antigens, occurs. So if somebody is living without a spleen because they had to have a splenectomy for whatever reason, maybe there was trauma and there was risk of bleeding out. If a spleen is ruptured, or even if a spleen is swollen, there's risk of rupturing, which means that there is an immediate risk of hemorrhaging to death. So if somebody's had trauma where the spleen is lacerated or the spleen looks like it's going to rupture and they're bleeding out, they've got to remove that spleen and cut off the blood supply, or that person's going to be very much at risk for bleeding out in a quick hurry. The spleen also helps us to remove old, worn-out red blood cells. Remember, red blood cells only last for 120 days in the system, and then they have to be recycled out. They have to be broken down. The hemoglobin gets broken down to amino acids. They get reused. The amino acids do. The heme gets broken down to bilirubin, eventually to biliverdin bile. So they have to be recycled, and the spleen is a major player in recycling old, worn-out red blood cells and irregular red blood cells. So these are all functions that it's filtering blood, it's looking for foreign antigens, looking for something that might be wrong that you would need to make sure you take out of the system. It's a blood reservoir, so a lot of times blood is stored here, and you know it's going to be filtering to look to see if the red cells are in a good shape. And in fetuses, it is even where we find stem cells. We think about blood cells, stem cells being in the red bone marrow, and that's really true. But in a fetus, you find stem cells also in the spleen. So when we think about immunity, look at all that we have, this amazing lymphatic system that protects us, lymph that's bathing our tissues and picking up anything that might be picked up from an injury or some sort of invasive, and bathing our tissue spaces, keeping them all clear. Lymph comes from blood and it gets returned back to blood by way of the subclavian vein. It gets filtered before it returns back through these lymph nodes. Tonsils are protecting us from foreign antigens and just trying to detect any time there might be a potential pathogen that actually we encounter. We have these areas where lots of nodes are that make sense to us because they're areas of common invasion, and that's going to be entry portals where we have openings, if you will. So like all around our head and also our genitalia, there are going to be a ton of those nodes that help to protect us. So what else? We talked about the spleen, so tonsils and spleens, and so we have all of those as well. When we think about defense, though, like immunity, protection, I want you to know that it's broken into two categories. The first category that we think about is called innate, and I know it's being called nonspecific here, but we refer to it as innate. Innate, I-N-N-A-T-E, means at birth. So you're born with it. They're kind of nonspecific in that it's not just fighting against one thing, one specific type of bacteria, or one specific type of fungus, or one specific type of protozoa. It's nonspecific. They're just protective, and you're born with these defenses. And then the next is called specific or adaptive immunity. So I will often refer to these two types as innate, nonspecific, or adaptive, which is specific. Okay, now let's first talk about things that you're just born with, okay, that can be protective. Well, you're born with skin. And skin is definitely a barrier that's keeping the inside in and the outside out, so that's certainly protective. The keratin is the major protein found in the epidermis, and it waterproofs us. It actually keeps us just the right pH and the right amount of dryness that is going to protect us from a lot of things. So it's said that your skin provides, because of even the microorganisms that are protective on your skin, your normal flora, your microbiome, they're actually protecting you by providing this acid mantle, which is almost like this invisible shield that you have that protects you from potential pathogens. This is why you don't have to walk around with like boils and Staph aureus and all kinds of infections all the time, because you're mostly protected because of the skin itself, and then also your microbiome that's on the skin. So it's wonderful. Your sweat actually has antimicrobial properties. Your oil, sebum, has antimicrobial properties. So you have skin. You have mucous membranes. You have a wet nose inside. You have mucus in your nose, in your mouth, in your GI tract. You have it, ladies, you have it in your vaginal secretion. So this mucus is good. You have it in the lower respiratory system. Mucus is good. It's trapping debris and actually is producing these enzymes that destroy bacteria. So, we're not breathing sterile air, are we? We're not. We don't live in a sterile environment. We live in a microbial environment. We have way more microorganisms than we do human cells that live in and on us. And that's okay, because we do have all of these mechanisms in place that are very, very protective, that we're just born with. We have fluids like our synovial fluids and pericardial fluid and all those fluids that also have a lot of times antibodies in them that we produce, which are proteins that we produce. So, those fluids are actually protective. Now the antibodies are specific and adaptive. But let's talk about nonspecific. We have all those cells that you all learned about in hematology that aren't just fighting against one thing. They kind of have, they fight against a bunch of things. Neutrophils. Neutrophils, we said, are going to be targeting bacteria. And they've got these antimicrobial granules that once released, they actually can digest out and destroy bacteria. We have eosinophils, which contain histamines and anti-parasitic properties that are going to help us against parasites and or allergens. We have basophils, which also have histamines and also have heparin, which has anticoagulant properties, keeping you from clotting unnecessarily when you don't want to be forming clots. We have lymphocytes, especially those lymphocytes. It's a category of them called natural killer cells. These guys are no joke, these natural killer lymphocytes. They have one function, and that's to circulate around looking for something that's not a self antigen. If something looks foreign to them, they're going to just attack it and destroy it. These guys are really just kind of no joke, and they're constantly circulating around looking for that. We have monocytes that act like big dump trucks of our system. They act as macrophages, big eaters, and they're going around just cleaning up debris and actually to also taking in things that look like they could be foreign. So we have all of these innate protections: skin, mucus, saliva, tears. Even the act of urinating clears the duct, the urethra. It actually keeps that clear. The act of defecating keeps that colon clear of materials. Our hair is protective, our eyebrows are protective, our eyelashes are protective. We have these cells that are protective that we're just born with. They are innate protections that are non-specific. They're not against just one thing, they're against a lot of things, and they allow for us to live in a microbial world and also a world where there are a lot of other potential pathogens. So we also have mechanisms that can happen that are protective. I know people hear about inflammation and then they think, what can we do to stop it, the inflammation? But the fact is, inflammation is protective. It is going to have some signs associated with it, and I need you all to know these signs, all four of them. It's redness, which we call erythema, swelling, edema, we call heat, and pain. All of these are signs of inflammation, which actually is not a bad thing. It's a good thing up to a point. Now, if there's too much inflammation, then we can start having some tissue problems and some damage. But up to a point, inflammation is actually incredibly protective. Let's see why. It limits the spreads of pathogens because that increased heat can actually suppress the pathogens from growing, and it can even destroy them. It can bring blood to the site, which are going to bring white cells to the site. Those white cells we just talked about, neutrophils and whatnot, and that can help to destroy them. It's going to bring monocytes to the site. It's going to bring nutrients, the increased blood, because this is all from increased blood. Hyperemia means bringing more blood flow. It's going to bring the nutrients that you need for tissue repair. Look what a wonderful thing. And even though pain might sound bad, it's really not. It lets you know that there's an injury to that site, and you stay off of it until it heals and you don't do any additional damage to it because you're aware of it, because you're feeling the pain. Now, itis always denotes inflammation. So if you ever see the suffix itis, whatever word's in front of it tells you what's inflamed. So I think most of us have seen that suffix, and you know that. So inflammation is, you're born with the ability to mount this mechanism called inflammation. It's a good thing. We don't want too much of it though, because it can then start to hurt some of the tissues. And we don't want too little of it, If we have too little of it, we have an immune problem, an immunocompromised problem. If we have too much of it, it could actually end up causing damage. We want it to be just right. And make sure you know the cardinal signs. Now, why we mount a response for inflammation is that we also produce, our tissues can produce these molecules that can call white blood cells to the site, call blood to the site, the blood to the site. And these damaged tissues, when tissues get damaged, they produce these signaling molecules, and it's groups of them: bradykinin, histamines, and leukotrienes. These are all, and cytokines. Cytokines, are they on here? Anyway, so cytokines as well. These are all molecules that are produced by damaged tissues when there's been an injury or an insult due to trauma or pathology, that pull this blood to the site, and that will stimulate vessels opening up and relaxing, allowing blood to come to the site, increasing permeability so that nutrients can move into the site, waste products and dead cellular debris can be removed away. And these are all very, very good things. So white cells being, I kind of like this little illustration where somebody steps on a splinter or has a splinter in their hand or whatever you might have done. But splinter moved through a splinter that isn't sterile. It's got microbes on it. Penetrated the skin. Well, that's okay. We have, from these damaged cells, these inflammatory chemicals, bradykinin, leukotrienes, cytokines, they're going to call the vessels to dilate, cause them to dilate. More blood's coming to the site. White cells can move into the tissue spaces to start to do their job. These are neutrophils that you're seeing here. I don't see any other types. But there would be monocytes and whatever. And this is helping to clean it out, rinse it, destroy any potential pathogens, eat them up. Macrophages here, eating them up, and helping to get rid of them and protect you. We are all born with these non-specific types of mechanisms that actually protect us. Where you'll see it happening with infection is sometimes you'll see pus, and pus gets a bad name. People will say, oh, that's disgusting. No, it isn't. It's the body's showing you that it's actually working. And it means that there are white blood cells coming to the reason pus looks white is that you have a lot of white blood cells, which are microscopic, but there's so many of them there that you're actually seeing the fluid, the tissue debris and tissue fluids looking white. And it means that there's a lot of white blood cells there. So it's doing its job. The cells are, the body is actually doing its job. Again, you want it to be up to a certain point. If there's too much swelling, too much stuff there, then you might sometimes have to drain, because actually, whatever. But let's talk about normal first, and most of the time it's all normal. Endothelial cells can actually, for repair, produce prostaglandins. These factors can actually start with tissue repair. Sometimes we get complete regeneration of tissues when the tissue repair happens. Sometimes if there's too many fibroblasts that become fibrocytes, this ends up leading to scarring. And with a scar, we don't get regeneration. We get healing, but if it's a scar, then it means we won't get regeneration there. We won't have the same function at that site. But as long as it's not too much of a margin, then it shouldn't be. I mean, you'll have a scar, but there will be healing at that site for the tissue repair. What we hope for is regeneration, where you get back full function. But a lot of times, if the margin's too wide of the injury, then there is going to be fibrosis, a fibrotic event. Fibrosis, a fibrotic event, means a scarring event. The tissue's repaired, but a scar was left and you didn't get regeneration at that site. We also have, just part of our innate immunity, we inherit the ability to make particular proteins. You all remember from AMP1 that it's our DNA that we get the recipes from our parents that we can actually produce through transcription and translation, the two steps from getting from DNA to a functioning protein. We inherit those recipes from our parents on our DNA molecule. We inherit this ability to make specialized proteins that are incredibly protective. I want to talk about this one group. There are different categories of this group, but they're called interferons. These proteins have antiviral and anti-cancer effects. And how they do this is that when viruses infect our cells, because viruses are parasites, they actually enter into our living cells and take over cell machinery. But before they can do too much damage, those cells that are invaded will actually make interferons that they release, and the neighboring cells get some protection from those viruses. So you can almost think about interferons as being an analogy of an interferon, and how it works is if your house in your neighborhood, your own house, got invaded by, I don't know, an army, let's say, which the viruses pretty much are, an army, a lethal army to that particular house. But before your house got destroyed, you would send out alarms so that your neighbors' house would start closing and barring their windows and barring their doors, and the neighboring cells, some of them, because of the interferons, the alarm that you sent out, they're going to be protected. So again, interferons are going to be these proteins that you have the ability to make when your cells become invaded that will limit the attack when they're attacked by particular viruses and or even sometimes cancer cells. So it's a really wonderful, wonderful ability that you can make these. We can actually make these synthetically now and give them. And so interferons are often used now to treat people that have like hepatitis B, which is it's a virus that attacks the liver, and hepatitis C, and even some cancers. So interferons are now being used medicinally for a lot of different viral and even cancer types of treatments. Are they a magic bullet? No, they're not magic bullets, but they have been used effectively to limit some of these particular infections. But we make them. They're non-specific. We just inherit the ability to be able to do them, and it's, again, a wonderful thing. Another group of proteins that we make are called complement proteins. These complement proteins, there are quite a few of them. This is showing you some of them. These complement proteins have been named just like C for complement 1, C2, C3, C4. They were named by when they were discovered. They were numbered by when they were discovered, but that's okay. But you have circulating around these complement proteins in your body fluids. They're just circulating around. You inherited the recipes and you have made them, and they are going to be present for when you need them. When you need them and when you get invaded by a potential pathogen, then these complement proteins get activated. There are a couple pathways, and that's just FYI, you don't need to know that, but there are a couple of pathways that get activated. But what it really means to you is that when your body needs them and they become activated, they're going to act like a domino effect, a cascading type of effect, where if they become activated, there will be 3 potential outcomes. And you're going to want to know what those potential outcomes are with complement protein activation. The first is inflammation, which I just told you is a good thing. Not a bad thing, it's a good thing. up to a point. And we know the cardinal signs of it. But we know that those cardinal signs are actually indications that the body is working to heal and to limit the infection or the spread, and to make sure that you're being taken care of, and that you have pain so that you know to be careful of the site until it heals. So inflammation is a good thing, and inflammation happens because of complement protein activation, and you inherited these complement proteins from your parents. They're there. A second thing that can happen is called opsinization. Opsinization is when these proteins will actually coat, they will cover up, they will coat a bacterial surface. And when they coat that bacterial surface, it makes it easier for your white blood cells to ingest them, phagocytize them. You can think of opsinization as the coating of these bacteria, just like you would coat an aspirin to swallow. If you've ever tried to swallow a dry aspirin, one of those little powdery dry aspirins, and you weren't given something to swallow it with, it would be really hard, right? But if you've got a coated one that's been coated, it's kind of easy to swallow them. It's really kind of the same thing. That's what these complement proteins do to the bacteria. They actually cover it up, and it makes it easier for those white blood cells that we know that phagocytize. Phagocytize means to eat, right? A cell that eats. It makes them easier to phagocytize. So yay for complement proteins. Yay for inflammation that is initiated by complement proteins. Yay for opsinization. And here's the third thing, and this is the third consequence of complement protein activation. It's called cytolysis. If I were to break this word down, it means lysing of a cell. And in cytolysis, if this were the plasma membrane of a cell, these complement proteins will penetrate the cell membrane until they're completely penetrated the membrane and caused a hole to be in this membrane, causing the cell to lyse, split. So the complement proteins themselves are actually destroying the enemy cell. All right, so 3 potential outcomes of complement protein activation. And another one, here's something else that you have that's just non-specific. It's fever. If you have a fever, I know people think fever gets a bad name, so when their temperature goes up, they think it's terrible and they just want to take an antipyretic. And chemicals that cause your temperature to be reset, your thermostat to be reset in the body, those chemicals are called pyrogens. Pyrogens reset that thermostat. Here's a pyrogen, so you can see that word. They reset the thermostat, but that's not a bad thing. That's actually a very good thing, because when your temperature is reset, it means your metabolism is going to increase. It means blood supply is going to come to the site for tissue repair and healing quicker. It means that increased temperature might suppress the growth of potential pathogens. All those things are very good things. But whenever we get inconvenienced by fever, we tend to want to take antipyretics, anti-inflammatories, antipyretics. And that's okay, but the fact is, fever is very protective up to a point. Children, pediatric populations can withstand much higher temperatures without any bad effects than adults can. But still, you do want to watch temperature. You want to make sure that the temperature is not continuing to rise. If it's getting to a new stadium, and this is going to be the important thing, is if normal body temperature, and this is in Celsius, 37 degrees, 98 Fahrenheit, 98.6 Fahrenheit. If it's in Celsius and you're normal, you're vacillating around. You don't ever stay at the same temperature. You're always moving around the set point. Once a body gets insulted by potential pathogens and/or injury can cause this. There are many different things that can lead to fevers. There will be a new stadium that's set. If you see the temperature rising and then you see the new stadium met and vacillating around that, you should leave it alone. Let me say that again. You should leave it alone and not treat it with antipyretics. The problem comes in is when you start seeing the temperature and it's getting too high, above 39. You know, it's getting closer to 40, even 41, and then you do have to take antipyretics because you can't let it go higher than that. But if you were to see it right here, you should, in a perfect situation, leave it alone because it's the body's going to be healing. It's going to be fighting any sort of potential pathogens, and this is going to be a good thing. When it starts to go back down to the normal set point, this period is called defervescence. So as the body temperature recalibrates back down, this period of time is referred to as defervescence. Okay, but fever is actually a good thing. So, now, what I've just been talking about, everything that we have, skin, hair, oil glands, sweat glands, tear glands, lacrimal glands, remember tear glands, ceruminous glands, the secrete earwax, saliva, salivary glands, all those digestive juices that we make, the hydrochloric acid in our stomach, the act of urinating, the act of defecating, our skin, all of our stuff that we think about, our ability to mount inflammation, our ability to have a fever, our complement proteins, our interferons, those are all innate, non-specific types of defense, and they're all wonderful. But now I want to talk about that second category of immunity. Oh, and don't forget the lymphatic system, and don't forget the spleen, and don't forget the tonsils, and don't forget the lymph nodes and all that lymphatic system. They're all non-specific too, and wonderful, right? But now let's talk about the specific immunity. I'm going to take if I can, I am going to figure out how to pause this. I don't know.